and get started. My name's Nancy Taylor, and I'm with the Forest Service, and I'm the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Program Manager in the Pacific Northwest region. And it's my pleasure to welcome Bill Hodge today. Bill is the Executive Director of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation based in Hungry Horse, Montana. And many of us also knew him when he was Executive Director of SAWS, Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards. And Bill was also on the 2021 National Wilderness Skills Institute core team, and I would venture to say still an honorary member. And we're always excited when he is able to pop in from time to time to our core team meetings. And a good friend, and really excited to have Bill here today to talk to us in a really good interactive session about the history leading up to the Wilderness Act. So I will be your moderator, and I'll watch the chat and for raised hands, Bill. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate that introduction. And a couple of notes from me. My pronouns are he, him. I live and work in and around the communities of Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet people here in Northwest Montana, though I'm not a native and would never pretend to speak for Native peoples. As was mentioned, my day job is to serve as Executive Director of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, or the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, and our work is in the 1.5 million acre Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, which includes the Bob Marshall, Scapegoat, and Great Bear Wilderness areas. And our work involves a deeply integrated relationship with the Flathead, Helena, Lewis and Clark, and Lolo National Forests, all of which have a portion of the Bob, as the complex is affectionately referred to as here in Northwest Montana. And again, before it was known as the Bob, these lands were simply the homeland and hunting grounds of dozens of tribes, including the aforementioned Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet nations. Here today, we're going to talk about sort of the history leading up to the passage of the Wilderness Act, but I think it's important to think about the Wilderness Act in context, which is a 20th century legal framework, as opposed to somebody's personal definition of what makes a place wild and self-willed. Well, again, as I mentioned, I have the great joy of getting to work in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex now after a number of years working in wilderness in the Southeast. While running Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, we had grown to serve about 64 different wilderness areas at the time. I think it's grown since I left to a few more areas. But if you put all 64 of those original areas together, they only equal about a third of the size of the Bob. And I think that just shows the range of the wilderness system that we have today. We have wilderness areas of all sizes, reaching from 6 acres rather, up to about 11 million acres. So that's quite a diversity of places. But we're going to talk a little bit about how we got to the point of having something called the Wilderness Act and what we do with that history as we think about its context in the 21st century. I'm trying to find a way to pour these out. So we're going to begin with some history going way back and sort of deal with some myths and some facts. If you think about the Americas in their totality, I don't know about you when you went to school, but I was sort of I don't know if I would say directly spoon-fed, but I was definitely given this picture of sort of this pristine landscape with a few scattered tribes here, when what's referred to as this pristine myth, as quoted by William Denevin, but it was probably something less than this untouched Eden that we also often like to think of the North American continent. For almost 14,000 years, humans had been developing cultures, living here and working in the landscape before 1492 when Columbus arrived in the shores. I mean, since the last of the ice sheets retreated about 12,000 years ago, these nomadic human populations began to actually establish and get rooted to place. And as these cultures and these people began to get rooted to place, they began to sort of be a part of a functioning ecosystem, which I think is what makes the clash in cultures, if you will, that began in 1492 relatively significant and starts to inform how we get to the point where we have something called the Wilderness Act, 1964. Because I this is sort of the way I like to look at it. There's this separation. There's this idea of those that lived here as part of the landscape in which they lived and thrived, and those who came from Europe, who came with sort of a different mentality, which is wild nature and wild places as something to be feared, and something that's sort of separate from where humans live. This line that I think can still very much inform us today of man as something separate from nature. If we go back to biblical teachings, this idea of dominion that some have, that man has dominion over the land as opposed to being a part of a functioning landscape. And so these two things obviously sort of come in contrast with one another after 1492, as we see with this illustration on the right, as Columbus arrives in America. But if you look at the map on the left, you get an idea of just how many cultures had evolved up to that point. Many that had come and gone. I mean, there were literally millions of people living in the Americas prior to 1492, and thousands of cultures, including thousands of cultures that had come and gone by 1492. So this wasn't an empty place. And this is something that we are going to talk about when we think about some of the language in the Wilderness Act that can be a little problematic depending on how you look at it. But those who came to this continent that were not native to this continent brought with them this Puritan idea of sort of man as separate from nature, wild places meant to be feared, ultimately meant to be tamed, and to use a term to be made pastoral, turn sort of unproductive lands into productive lands, which is kind of interesting. This Puritan idea rooted in Christianity, which if you think about some of the language from the Bible that sort of saw wilderness as a place of the divine. Anybody can think about 40 days and 40 nights as wildernesses where people went to get divine teachings, if you will, but yet still carried through in this culture. And as Europe evolved, as Christianity evolved, this idea of man and nature as separate, running headlong into two continents, frankly, where man had evolved sort of as a part of a functioning ecosystem. So I think it's important to note that those two views, while maybe not universal, sort of collide in 1492. So here we're going to talk a little bit about what happens post 1492. Is there anybody that can share with me sort of in 2 words what this map on the right can be described as? Anybody want to pop that into chat? Second. 2-word description. Well, often you've maybe heard the term manifest destiny. That is what this map really kind of represents. This is the colonization of the North American continent. It begins in 1492, picks up in earnest in the 1600s, and spreads westward through the 1700s, 1800s, to where we get to a map that represents the United States of today. This idea of public commons was really not there as these places were being purchased, won, vanquished. Of course, during this time was the displacement and the dramatic impacts on the cultures that existed on the North American continent prior to the arrival of Columbus in 1492. Cultures that were wholly displaced. We think about native cultures up and down the eastern seaboard that in the 1830s were finally and once and for all displaced out of their homeland, moved to the west, put on top of Western culture, Western native cultures, and all of those cultures sort of being herded into a reservation system as manifest destiny sort of played itself out. hope that this conversation doesn't trigger anybody either way. This is just sort of what was going on. The displacement of millions. Frankly, many of those lives lost to disease and war, and those that remained being displaced and cultures being subjugated underneath colonization of the continent. Meanwhile, as that culture, this new American culture, begins to become something of its own, we begin to see a shift a little bit in the latter parts of this period of 1492 to 1860 of wild nature maybe no longer being something to be feared. And that's captured in this painting on the left, which is by one of the Hudson Valley painters of the 1820s, Albert Bierstock. This is called After the Storm in the Rockies. And those group of painters and a group of romantic writers from the period actually began to shift societal views on wild places as these writings and these paintings began to sort of project these places as cathedrals of their own. So if you think about the 1820s, it's still very much a brand new independent nation. And we're wrestling with what America is going to be, what makes America as a nation different than the countries in Europe and elsewhere. And these painters and these romantic writers actually helped inform that a lot of what we started to project America as making it different was this collection of wild places, this sort of Eden, this sort of beautiful landscape untouched by man, which of course is, again, a false myth, but is something that begins to define our nation a little bit and at least takes that Puritan view of all nature as something to be conquered and made productive, and is actually shifted to something that can be feared and considered important. Slides function some of the time in this format. Sorry. So as we go through this period of shift of viewing nature as maybe something that could define a young nation, we start to actually see the idea of setting aside some of this beauty as something that we all own collectively. Think about those who came from a feudal society in Europe where only the rich owned land and everybody else was there to serve and work on behalf of those who own the land. This idea of actually having our own public commons. And it's kind of amazing to me, I don't know about you, but to think about that in the midst of the Civil War is the first sort of federal action to set aside public commons, which is Abraham Lincoln signing the Yosemite Grant Act, which was meant to stem the development of the Yosemite Valley, sort of uncontrolled and unbridled exploitation of the Yosemite Valley. It didn't establish Yosemite as a national park, but it did intend to set it aside. And that goes on in the middle of the Civil War. We do get our first national park in 1872, war is over. Our first wildlife refuge after the turn of the century in 1903. And you can see the rest here. The Forest Service was formally created out of our forest preserves in 1905. The Park Service is finally created in 1916 after we already had 5 national parks, but had no entity in which to manage those national parks until the Park Service was created. Of course, we had Pelican Island in 1903, but we actually don't get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service until 1940. And then the BLM is finally established in 1946 after having been the General Land Office beginning in 1812. The General Land Office had a very different purpose than what BLM has today. The General Land Office was meant to take holdings owned by the federal government and sort of make them available, get the country to populate those regions. But the BLM finally gets established in 1946. So we have this establishment of our public land sort of system as we know it today. We have the Forest Service, we have Fish and Wildlife, we have BLM, and yet we're starting to feel some tension about what's going to happen with public lands as we go. And that moves us to those public commons, and sort of this period in which they were being established is also the same time in which they're somewhat under siege. There were forces, for example, with the Forest Service, who didn't want to see the Forest Service created, wanted to see the Forest Service fail because they saw the forest, sort of the robber baron era, as places that could be turned into monetary gain. And yet we had this galvanizing moment in 1910 with the big burn, Great Fire in Idaho and Montana, sort of put the Forest Service up on its feet, stood it up, and yet we had a series of things that happened over the next decades, that both stand up our public land system, but then also start to see that we've got some challenges if we actually want to hang on to that nugget of beautiful, untouched landscapes. Sort of put this timeline together for you all, and its importance to sort of the Sierra Club being formed in 1892 by John Muir and others, sort of that helped inform the idea of protecting Yosemite Valley. Talk about John Muir a little bit more in a little bit. But the Sierra Club becomes important in the Wilderness Act, as does the Wilderness Society. Sierra Club really begins to find its purpose in life, if you will, when the flooding of Hetch Hetchy was first proposed to provide a water supply for San Francisco after the Great Fire of 1906. Shortly after that, we actually had the first idea of setting aside a place for its wilderness values with the Gila Wilderness in 1922. Well, many of you probably heard 1924, but it was actually proposed in 22. And Leopold's memo was promptly lost for 2 years, and then found in 24. And the Gila becomes the first administratively designated in 1924. Unfortunately, the Sierra Club loses its battle over trying to protect Hetch Hetchy. Dam is completed, valley inundated, beginning in 1923. A date maybe some of you aren't familiar with is this November 1933 date, which is when the president put together a commission to study the idea of a scenic byway in the United States. This is the road that we all now know as the Blue Ridge Parkway that connects Shenandoah National Park, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And that's important because that actually leads to a pivotal moment in the formation of the Wilderness Society. In 1934, at a foresters convention in Knoxville, Tennessee, there was a field trip held and led by a gentleman named Benton Mackay. Those were Appalachian Trail enthusiasts may recognize that name. Benton was the gentleman who had the vision for the Appalachian Trail, but at the time was working for the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he took this field trip out to see a dam. I believe they were going to see Norris Dam in East Tennessee, and on that trip included Bob Marshall, who at that time was now a Forest Service employee once again after an earlier step in the Forest Service, Bernard Frank, another Forest Service employee, and a lawyer out of Knoxville, Tennessee named Harvey Broom. And there was a pretty animated discussion in that car about this proposed road, this scenic byway that we now know as the Blue Ridge Parkway. And Harvey Broom was, as a Knoxville native, was pretty animated. That road was actually going to do significant harm to the few remaining wildlands in the eastern United States. As the story goes, the conversation sort of boiled over, the radiator boiled over, they had to pull over, and they sat on a grassy knoll on the side of the road, and in 1934 wrote the Articles of Incorporation of the Wilderness Society. Harvey Broom thought there was not enough effort being done to stop the development of that road, and he had a kindred spirits and the other three that were in the car with him in realizing that having national parks, having national forests, having wildlife refuges was not going to be enough to protect wild nature, that we needed to do more. And so those Articles of Incorporation are written in 34 and adopted formally in 1935. So we've got the Sierra Club. It's been formed. It's fought a battle over Hetch Hetchy. The Wilderness Society is created to to deal with this idea that we're starting to wrestle with what are we going to do with, with protecting what wildness we have left. Again, go back to the myth of that this was a totally wild landscape, which is not true. But there was significant wildness returning to these landscapes. And so this all sort of comes together in a battle over the proposal to flood a whole bunch of sections of the Colorado River, but specifically the Green River in what is dinosaur at this point had become Dinosaur National Monument, place called Echo Park. Sorry, head office there. And the proposal to flood the Green River at Echo Park became a rallying point for both organizations, the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club. And realizing that having dinosaurs a national monument was not enough to save it from this proposed dam. Ultimately, they do save it, but it led to this rather interesting battle and dog and pony show in the halls of Congress with David Brower and particularly Howard Zomheiser, the executive secretary of the Wilderness Society, co-opted this AV cart and ran around the halls of Congress showing this video of what would happen if they were allowed to flood Echo Park by damming up the river, and had the example of what had happened at Hetchy in what is now Sierra National Park as an example of things that we needed to stop. And that idea ultimately led to the introduction of the Wilderness Act in 1906. I want to talk about a few names real quick, and again, if anybody has any questions, I hope you'll jump in here. If you have any thoughts and comments too, certainly hope. Well, I want to throw out our second poll question if I can there, Vic, and get your all's feedback real quick at this point. Question is the collective history of public lands in America appropriate to share these days? Not in this presentation, in general. Thank you. Has the full snapshot of how we came. Yeah, not surprised with this group. Go ahead and poll. Share the results from the poll. Most of us recognize that the way in which we tell the story of our public lands leaves an awful lot out. If I go back and show, sometimes this doesn't work. If you think about that timeline of as the Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and BLM is being created, there are parts of that that actually still overlap with the displacement of native cultures across the country. The Forest Service is created in 1905. It wasn't until 1910 that the last of the Blackfeet holdings were sort of removed from their control with the creation of Glacier National Park, when they lost the rights to hunt, timber, and graze what is now the east side of Glacier National Park, basically where I live on the Divide country. So those two things are overlapping. It's not two separate eras. The eras kind of have an intersection that I think sometimes gets left out. I can be candid that as a young man growing up, this idea of public lands just felt so noble and so important as a part of our country, and it is. But if it's not shared in its full context, then we're going to struggle with how we keep the relevance for that idea as we wrestle with our history. I bring a few people forward here in this section of the presentation to talk about some people that maybe you don't know as well as others. I mentioned John Muir earlier. One of the things that the Sierra Club has now wrestled with, and that any of us who've ever owned a T-shirt that had a Muir quote on it or a coffee mug that had a Muir quote on it, is to recognize he was not a monolith. He's not this beacon of protection of wild places. He was a man who had racist views and wrote those racist views into some of his writings. He felt public commons were only for the few. We have a lot of historical figures that we often point to that I think we need to wrestle with as we think about our relevance for the Wilderness Act moving forward now in the 21st century, of how do we contextualize it for those that live today. I say this to you, and I'm now about to show you a bunch of dead white people, but I think it's important to recognize that there are pieces of our past too that I think are pretty important and have relevance in the work we're all doing today. This is not a shameless plug for where I get to work, but for this, because I've had a chance to sort of digest all I can about Bob Marshall. He is a figure from this period. Again, he's on that field trip that leads to the creation of the Wilderness Society. Ultimately, he is the original funder of the Wilderness Society, literally writes the first executive secretary's salary. Robert Sterling Yard came out of Bob Marshall's personal account. He would very much fit in today's social justice movement. Bob was a gentleman when asked to write some of the original recreation policies for the Forest Service, tried to root out racism and discrimination in Forest Service policies. He proposed integrating Forest Service campgrounds in the South 20 years before the military considered integrating their operations. He proposed the removal of permits from permittees who were practicing discrimination and was successful in doing that. And in some of his early actions, proposed creating pipelines for those who lived in urban centers to have access to and to get out to these beautiful public lands, which is, as we all know, tend to be in more rural parts of our country and often removed, not always, but often removed from our urban centers, and therefore have become almost irrelevant to a lot of the communities that live in our urban settings across the country. So again, Bob was a man who I think would fit very much in today's ethos. Absolutely a workers' rights advocate, so much so that he was accused of being a communist. He was an unabashed socialist, even as a millionaire. I think he's a pretty Renaissance man. He's an agency employee, he was a millionaire and a socialist. He spent time both in the Forest Service and at the Department of Interior. Here he worked at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He squeezed a lot into a short life. Bob, again, was a very important part of the Wilderness Society being formed. Sadly, he did not live to see the Wilderness Act passed, because Bob died in 1939 at the age of 38. He was a voracious hiker. He had some health issues that cut his life short, sadly, but and he was such an instrumental figure with the Forest Service that in 1940, less than 1 year after his death, Forest Service took where I get to work, Bob Marshall Wilderness, and designated it his name, something I think he would actually be opposed to, recognizing the important figure he was for protecting wild places. Howard Zonheiser was executive secretary of the Wilderness Society when the Wilderness Act was introduced, which was first in 1956, and he's often referred to as the principal author of the act. I think that is correct. He's not the only person to contribute, though, to the writing of the Wilderness Act. But he, along with David Brower from the Sierra Club, were the two instrumental figures that would do the hard work of not being out in these wild places, but being in the halls of Congress, trying to push through this idea of protecting wilderness within the context of our still relatively young public lands system. Howard grew up in Pennsylvania, was the son of a minister himself, had been a federal bureaucrat at one point working for the federal government, but was a tireless advocate for the idea, and was a part of continuing to shepherd the act through for the next 8 years, from 1956 to 1964, where the bill itself was rewritten over 60 times. I always like to point out one interesting fact about the change from 1956 to 1964 when the bill finally passed, because it's relevant to the place that I get to work. In 1956, as the bill was written, A place would become designated wilderness if one of the land management agencies recommended a piece of the land that they managed to be wilderness. And if within 5 years Congress did not act, then that place would become a federally designated wilderness. So what that would mean, though, is that the agency would have ultimate control over what would become wilderness. And by 1964, as the bill got rewritten, that changed. And no longer was it a requirement for the agency to recommend acres, even though the agencies were charged with doing an analysis of the acres that they had, and they had 10 years in which to complete that analysis, almost none of which was met. But it now said the only way wilderness could be established in the United States was by an act of Congress. So the requirement for agency recommendation went away between the first draft of 56 and the final version of the bill in 1964. And I share that with you with Howard here because Howard's shepherding that through this whole process. Again, David Brower was his colleague working the halls, telling the story of Echo Park and Dinosaur National Monument. And while there were many people and many organizations that were involved, passage of the Wilderness Act, these two from our history are very important on the actual act of getting the bill written, getting it through Congress. I want to share one more person with you as it relates to the bill getting drafted. Holly Dyer began her conservation work in the 1950s, and very important for the protection of the Olympic Peninsula and the rest of the wildness of the state of Washington. And most famously, was the person who gave Howard Zonheiser the word untrammeled in that phrase from the Wilderness Act. And I love this sort of through line of Holly just died in 2016, and I actually had a chance to meet her, and still a passionate advocate in 2014 when we got to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. Here was somebody who actually provided one of the most important words in the Wilderness Act, that term of untrammeled. All right, I'm going to jump to our third poll question, if I can. How do you view the Wilderness Act? It is a great example of public good. It is an imperfect idea that has accomplished a lot of important things. The law now feels outdated and needs to be refreshed, but the wilderness should be returned to local indigenous populations. That's about 90% of you participating, so I'm going to poll and share the results with you. Overwhelming majority say it is an imperfect idea that has accomplished a lot of important things. With a few votes also for the other three phrases, and I think that's it's very important, the range of ways in which we view the Wilderness Act. So again, we think it's an imperfect idea, but it's an important thing, right? Say that's probably pretty squarely where I fall. I've thought a lot about that third answer, which is the law now feels outdated and needs to be refreshed. I know there has been a significant amount of conversation about the context of the Wilderness Act in 2022. I, for one, I think would more than anything, I would use the word fearful of what would happen if we unlocked the law itself. A lot of bad things would have the possibility of happening. But I'm also very much, I guess I would say, in tune with the idea of local control, particularly local indigenous populations. One of the important landscapes here in Montana that adjoins the Bob Marshall Works complex is the Badger II Medicine. It is federal land. It's part of the Forest Service. but an effort to make sure that the Blackfeet have a hand in what happens ultimately with the Badger 2 medicine. Very important place in their current and historic culture is, I think, an important endeavor. Sometimes something that's lost in the world. Slide. Everybody's seeing that. Those of you who've been working at this for a while, obviously will recognize this language. Those of you who are maybe entering your first year, this is straight out of the Wilderness Act. And I wanted to highlight just one phrase here. I think the whole purpose statement from the law is important. But the word preservation and protection of natural condition is an important part of what the law, what the intent was behind the law, that we were losing landscapes as they were used to functioning. Even though we had this ever-growing system of public lands, whether it's the rush to recreation, particularly the rush to recreation through the windshield, we were starting to impact the function of a lot of these lands. The Wilderness Act held within it this idea of preservation and its natural condition was a pretty important aspect of what the intent was behind the Wilderness Act. I like to think of the Wilderness Act as I have been an advocate for the wilderness idea, not just a steward of the preservation system, is this this idea that wilderness is a tool, preservation is a tool in the toolbox of conservation. It's not always the right answer, but often it can be the right answer. It's a tool which you can pull back, pull out, particularly if you want to have an idea of what's going to happen. You don't manipulate the landscape. As we have found through our history, and not so distant future, we often don't have it right as a species when we think we know what's right for the function of an ecosystem. Let's take fire as an example, where we thought fire on the landscape was bad. And now I think we all pretty much can agree fire is an integral part of ecosystem function. Very, 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 almost all of our landscapes. Aldo Leopold himself had it wrong about the balance between predator and prey, and admitted so in his famous Fierce Green Fire. So this idea that we're going to preserve things as they are sort of becomes the underlying purpose behind the act itself. In the legal definition of what wilderness is, again, I've highlighted a few pieces here. To me, the two most important words of the act are the words "in contrast." In contrast with those areas where man and his work dominate the landscape. This is a question we often have to ask ourselves these days, as we have a lot of legitimate ecological pressure on making decisions for the wilderness system in an era of rapid change, in an era of changing global systems like climate, of what role does wilderness play? I always come back to those two words, in contrast. What role does wilderness play? Maybe it gives us, again, that baseline of what happens when we do nothing, even if we see consequences that maybe as a larger environmentalist we might be uncomfortable. This second line I've highlighted, I want to go back to the whole sort of theme of this evolution of public lands on a landscape in which had been a peopled landscape for 14,000 years. And this is the one phrase that if I sometimes want to scratch my head on and wonder if we could have thought about differently, is this line of where man himself as a visitor does not remove. Now, I think the intent and what it says might be two different things. I think the intent in my mind was that these are not places in which we're going to intentionally populate. These are places that man is only going to be sort of a ephemeral part of the function of the landscape. But by putting that line in there, we have sort of marginalized the populations that existed in North America long before 1492. It's just one phrase I wanted to sort of highlight. And the other thing that I want to highlight too, that sort of undoes this idea that the Wilderness Act misses the idea that this was not Eden, this was not an unmanipulated landscape. We do know that native populations stewarded the land in ways in which we steward the land to this day. Fire was a part of managing the land. There were earthworks in South America prior to 1492, which were there to provide for irrigation and hold back waters. So there was a manipulation of the landscape before we got here. But I think these words, these sort of qualifying words that are in the act, doesn't say that we're assuming these places are genuinely pristine, but that they generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. And the imprint of man's work is substantially unnoticeable. Those are qualifiers. It doesn't say man's imprint is not noticeable, but they are substantially unnoticeable. And I think that that's sort of, whether intentional or not, was a nod back to, while we think of wilderness as these pristine landscapes, they aren't necessarily. And as somebody who began my wilderness work in the Southeast, almost every wilderness that you go into in the Eastern United States at one point maybe was completely cut over. Citico Creek Wilderness in the Cherokee National Forest, I can still take you to logging cables wrapped around old chestnut stumps. But these places can return to their sort of primeval function of nature sort of being self-willed and in charge. So legal definition of the act, we're to the point where the law, as it's written today and is interpreted today. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. We have one more poll question. As wilderness as an idea evolves, does the full history of landscapes demand a public input process for public dialogue? How do we wrestle with contextualizing wilderness in the 21st century? Universal. All of us agree that we should be sharing conversations about the landscape and what we are to do with the wilderness idea moving forward. Interesting, contrast that against our earlier question, where most of us agree that while it's not a perfect instrument, it's an instrument for good. So with that, I'd love to, we've got just about 30 minutes left, which is what I wanted to leave for us to be able to share, ask questions. Would love to hear other perspectives. I'll be the first to tell you, this is sort of my way of thinking about how society evolved, how two societies were thrust together through colonization, how that society evolved to the point where we have public commons. And once we had those public commons, the recognition that even having those public commons was maybe not going to be enough to protect wild nature. And I think most of you would agree wild nature can also be flower pushing up to the crack of the sidewalk. It doesn't have to be like a Wrangell St. Elias Wilderness in Alaska. But with that, I'd love to see if anybody would like to jump in, share your thoughts, ask questions. I'll be the first to say I don't have all the answers, but if I don't, I'll try to help find them, or somebody else will have it. And as Nancy says in the chat box, feel free, if you'd rather not turn on your microphone and camera, you can ask the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, and if raise hand is in the reactions down on the bottom ribbon. And again, as Bill just said, if you'd rather put something in the chat, then that's great too. Love to hear from you.
Anybody have a different thought on the history and how I presented it? See, my buddy Ian's turned on so camera at least. Maybe he'll unmute himself too.
Well, hi, Bill. I'll just say hello to folks, and I always appreciate hearing your perspective. So, it's just an ongoing learning process for me, having been in this realm of work for 20 plus years. So thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, it's always good to see that. Is it Lawrence? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, that's correct. So I'm new to the forest, but what stood out to me, and I think the second slide when you brought up some of the actual language of the act was, I think, point 3, where it had a specific designation, 5,000 as the lower limit, minimum limit. And I was curious to pick your brain on was that more to kind of satiate Congress at the time for passage, or was that really written in the lens of future generations?
It's a good question, and it later gets clarified. Are you guys seeing this again?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this gets clarified 10 years later, or 11 years later, 1975, with the bill that's often referred to as the Eastern Wilderness Scariest Act. That's not actually what that was called, but that's what it's referred to as. And Congress clarified this because the Forest Service in particular was leaning into this. Section 3 here has at least 5,000 acres of land or is of sufficient size as to make practical its preservation and use of it. Congress said that when the Forest Service was not recommending any places under 5,000 acres, that they were misinterpreting that section and missing the whole separate second part of that line where it says or of sufficient size, which is how we now have Pelican Island, which is 6 acres. G Creek Wilderness in the Cherokee National Forest is well under 5,000 acres of it. There are a lot of examples of wilderness areas that are under 5,000 acres. Pelican Island is practical to manage as a wilderness because it's an island, right? So they can manage that wilderness for it. I can't say whether I know for sure that this was a negotiation that was misinterpreted in terms of your question, whether it was negotiated during the passage of the Wilderness Act to placate some. I do know that there was some concern as it appeared that the Wilderness Act was going to pass. The original 9 million acres were established with the Wilderness Act's passage, was that wilderness would start to creep down the mountainsides and into the timber country. There's a lot of that original 9 million acres, particularly out west, with rock and ice. But of course now they were right. It was going to come down the slopes, and we now have a system that's just under 100. But yeah, we did sort of do away with that hard 5,000 acre. Congress clarified with the eastern areas of Wilderness Act.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you bet. So Ray asked a question about conflicts over allowing commercial services in wilderness may reduce public and political support for future wilderness designations. This would sort of take us into a conversation about the act itself and the prohibitions in the act. I have a new sort of perspective on this, having worked here in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex for the last 3 years. That there is a prohibition on commercial activities in the wilderness, and yet in the complex we probably have no less than 70 functioning outfitters in the complex, and that comes from that all of those prohibitions that are listed in the Wilderness Act, which I don't have a slide. I apologize. The very next section after the prohibitions of activities in the wilderness is the language around except those activities will be allowed for the administration of the wilderness itself. Interpretation of allowing commercial outfitting in a wilderness as big as the complex, Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, is that most of Americans wouldn't have that opportunity to have that primitive and unconfined form of recreation if left to their own devices. It's outfitting something to act. That's the justification behind allowing commercial outfitting was to sort of address what I consider that fourth character, which is the opportunity for solitude or primitive recreation, and that in a place as big as 1.5 million acre Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex or the 2.5 million Frank, Idaho, the public being able to share in those places is augmented by the fact that we have outfits. And it would be, Ray, it would be a difficult political lift to somehow more stringently enforce that no commercial activity. It also gets complicated in an era of social media of what's a commercial activity. If I go backpack across a wilderness area, and I take a bunch of pictures, and I find a way to monetize those pictures after the fact. Is that a commercial activity? And I think it's a balancing act. You have to sort of wrestle with every day of hoping that most of Americans will value wilderness for its intrinsic value, just that it's value in the fact that it exists, while not always throwing cold water on the other ways in which it brings value, right? Because there's obviously the ecosystem services side of it, water, carbon sequestration, all those sort of things that are system. Okay.
I had a question.
Sure.
So thanks very much for your presentation. And this kind of going off of what you just said about commercial activity, and then going back to your third question about how we view the Wilderness Act and that law feeling outdated, maybe needing to be refreshed. Is something I think a lot about as I'm in the wilderness, like how can we make it more accessible, more maybe social justice oriented, acknowledging that Indigenous people had history here, that people of color and women have less access potentially to even kind of the resources they need to get out into the wilderness. And then thinking about how the act would be updated, if it could be updated, because you kind of mentioned at some point that you were fearful of what would happen if we got rid of the Wilderness Act, which is something I feel a lot as well. But trying to balance that fear of getting rid of it with how can we change it to make it more of a 21st century act that kind of balances or takes into account changes that have happened in the last 50 years. I was just wondering, I don't have any answers for that, but it's something I think about a lot as I work in the wilderness, how we could change it, address things now. So I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts about maybe a new wilderness ethic that's more representative of the time we live in now.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of things come to mind. And is it Andy? Do I have that right?
Yes.
So a few things come to mind. One is I think the work to make wilderness for everybody is going to require some real intentionality. And I think that intentionality is probably for the most part going to be led by our partner community organizations like one that I work for. It's not that we're dragging the agencies with us kicking and screaming. It's that we have more, we might be more pliable in how we can do our work. So to sort of speak at how we look at it at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation is we're specifically creating new partnerships so that some of our trips have historically, well, not exclusively, have been dominated by older white people, have the means, the time off, the ability to do a 7 to 9 day trip to go in and help keep trails open, eradicate basic weeds or whatever. Realized we were going to have to change the way in which we did the work, make sure that all communities had access to that experience. But it takes some real intentionality, and it takes some thinking about doing it in the context of the Wilderness Act. It started out 6 years ago with a trip called Girls in the Bob, because a lot of folks who maybe are intimidated by the wilderness experience would be less intimidated if they went with a group of people who have similar life experiences. And then that's now extended to trips that we're doing with Montana, which is a BIPOC group out of originally connected to the Parks and Rec Department of the city of Missoula, to this year doing trips with Upward Bound on the Flathead Reservation with the Salish and Kootenai people, and doing a trip with Blackfeet youth. But on both of those latter two, I do want to caution on one thing, which is as we think about making wilderness more relevant for communities, we should become more relevant for communities. Carolyn Finney, who wrote a great book called Brown Faces and White Spaces, pointed out that we often in our world, in our public lands or our conservation world, we think of success and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. It's in just doing a good job of inviting more people to our table, as opposed to us going to others' tables, and what we can do to be an important part on the Flathead Reservation or the Blackfeet Reservation, in our case here in Montana. So I think it's the intentionality, but I also think it's going into those new relationships or fostering deeper relationships that involve a lot more listening, sharing. I'm the biggest nerd in the world. I'll go talk to anybody anytime about the Wilderness Act and the Wilderness Preservation System, but I need to learn to go listen more about. Had the chance to spend some time at the Cutswood School in Browning on the Blackfeet Reservation, where they're trying to continue to stand up their language, teach their language. And so I think intentionality is the word that comes to mind for me. And then that listening piece also means that when you share why wilderness matters to you, listen why the word wilderness doesn't exist in Blackfeet vocabulary, as an example. But yesterday we had a presentation with the training for our staff with Sally Thompson, who wrote the book People for the Park, which is about the native history of what is now Glacier National Park, our neighbors north. She brought a Salish elder with her, Myra, and the one thing that struck to me after our conversation with Myra is the one thing that native populations had with their homeland and their place that we all feel about wilderness is the sense of reverence. It maybe comes from two different places. Reverence maybe came from a collection of stories and human history versus reverence that comes from the idea of watching an ecosystem still function on its own. But reverence is sort of something that I think is something that's really come to my mind, particularly here in the last 24 hours after the conversation yesterday. I don't know if I got at your question there, Andy. That's sort of some of the ways that I look at it.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Leslie?
Hi, my name is actually Liz. I'm just borrowing it from the computer.
Okay, great.
So this kind of piggybacks what you guys were just talking about. I'm from Colorado, and I don't work in the Maroon Bells Wilderness, but it's not too far from me. And I don't know if you're aware of that wilderness area or not, but it's it's very popular. And I feel like so torn always between like making all of this more accessible and inclusive. And then, you know, in places like the Maroon Bells Wilderness, you need a permit in order to like even enter the wilderness. So like, where's the balance between trying to get more people out there and like creating this permitting system, which I feel like as a public land, like worker, whatever employee, like I should be like more for permitting because it helps like protect resources, but I am kind of not that way because I feel like it's just exclusive and creates more barriers for people who don't have the means and ways to even like know how to get a permit or want to deal with that whole system, or maybe it's an intimidation for them to get out there. So I don't know what your view is on that, but I'd be interested in hearing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the oversimplistic answer is we want people to value wilderness whether they ever set foot in it, right? But certainly aware of the dynamics, the challenges that particularly conundrum hot springs in the Maroon Bells and a lot of places. I think sometimes we're a little bit to it, Bob, because it is so difficult to earn, like generally 8 or 9 miles before you get to the wilderness boundary. But I don't know. I've thought about that a lot as we've done our intentional work to connect more communities to the wilderness idea and to the wilderness itself, because those are two different things, right? Connecting folks to the wilderness idea versus physically connecting people to a wilderness experience. And I know there's a lot of sort of, I'm going to say hand-wringing going around about even things like leave no trace and does the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with the principles. I think the principles are all great, but sometimes the way they're presented puts up a barrier to people. Your example of the permit system for Maroon Bells is one of those moments where we're balancing the congressional mandate of preserving wilderness character. Like, so in one sense, we're violating the primitive, particularly the unconfined form of recreation by requiring a permit, completely undone the unconfined, but you're doing it to protect the natural conditions on the landscape. I think it's one of about three things we're going to have to wrestle with as a community in the decades ahead, because population is not going down. And as we do more of this intentional work to connect more, we're gonna have more people that want to come have these experiences. And who are those of us who've had those experiences to say that somebody else shouldn't get to have those, right? I know you're not saying that at all, but I wrestle with that because it can fundamentally change the landscape. That's why, for one, I'm just vehemently opposed to the idea of mountain bikes and roads, because it just makes it that many more, getting that much further in, creating more changes in ecosystem function, particularly like stuff like wildlife behavior. And just, first to say, every user group has an impact. But I think I don't know, it's something I think about a lot. Something I think about a lot as we try to create these new connections. What makes me feel good about doing that work while recognizing that we could inadvertently overrun the system, and many places are already overrun. As somebody who spent a decade working in wilderness east, a lot of those places, Raven Cliffs Wilderness in Georgia is less than an hour drive for 5 miles in a minute. I've been on a trail in Raven Cliffs with 400 other people in the same 4-hour period. I balance that against I'd rather them have that experience and us try to find the creative ways to mitigate those impacts while being mindful of trying to present the idea that you can experience wilderness when you set foot in it, but even when you don't. That is a well that downstream is where our clean drinking water originates. It's where carbon sequestration is going to happen as we deal with the emerging climate crisis. I think it's just something that's one of those things that we're going to wrestle with. Which I had a definitive, here's the solution, because the climate question is the other, right? Some wilderness areas no longer, particularly in Alaska, no longer represent what they were even set aside for, because of Alaska sort of being the tip of the spear for our country for climate change. And there are some incredibly smart wilderness loving people who think we may have to start doing more manipulation. We start to lose the thread there. Those are a couple of the big ones, is how do we make it relevant to people without overwhelming the system, and how do we deal with being hands off in an era of incredibly change.
Thank you. That was
Good questions, comments? We've still got about 12 minutes left. You guys found this helpful? Hope you do your own research. A couple things while you maybe think of some other questions. A few books I'd recommend. 1492, which gives 1491. Sorry, a snapshot of the Americas prior to Columbus's arrival is a very important read, I think. A Wilderness Original, which is a biography on Bob Marshall, which is awfully influential in what we wound up with today, writing some of those early recreation rules and regulations that, quite frankly, underpin this act is today. For sort of the wilderness. So, a few recommendations there.
Right. Thank you, Bill. And